your work in the last few decades and probably longer, obviously a real polarization here of these arguments of animal versus plant, and it's become a real ideological battleground, and not just amongst the general population, seemingly amongst scientists as well. So, in your opinion and research, what do you think are some of the reasons, or even some of the nuances for this increasing polarization, which seems mostly in a lot of the Western discourse?
Yeah, that's a great point. I certainly am exposed to a lot of polarization from all sorts, researchers, social media, etc. And I think it's really driven around a few different issues. One of the largest ones for scientists is probably the environmental side of things. So, how do we sustainably produce food for a growing global population, approaching 10 billion by 2060, 2070? How can we do this with our limited resources? So, animal source foods often get a bad rap. Beef is often in the news for, destroying rainforest, driving all sorts of problems, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. So that's sort of a lot of scientists are, hesitant to really kind of promote or encourage animal source foods in some contexts because of that concern. And then they're also attacked, I'm sure, as you know, from sort of the nutrition side. There's this idea that plant-based is always healthy and better, and animal source foods are kind of to be discouraged in the West, at least. It's not really the way it is if you look globally. Actually, the animal source foods are really prized for they're kind of aspirational, and they also, of course, they fill you up. They're high in protein. So this dissonance, I think, is really interesting because, in the West, if you look at most of the people who are sort of advocating for reductions or limitations or, drastic limitations or even exclusion of animal source foods, they're in Western countries. They're in the US, they're in Europe or Australia. You don't really see that in other countries. I think that's important to recognize because most of the world is actually not in high income countries. About 84% of the world are people living in low and middle income countries, and they have a very different perspective. So it's certainly possible to have a healthy diet with very little animal source foods if you're really careful and intentional about it, but it's not always easy. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And the challenges of the busyness and hecticness of life, whatever country you're in. And obviously it compounds things when we're lower or middle income, because we have to then, make certain decisions. And if we maybe start this conversation at the policy level, the great food transformation by the Lancet Commission there in 2019, targeting red meat as both an unhealthy food and, of course, environmentally harmful. Now, of course, we have things like factory farming and whatnot that we'll touch on a little further on in this discussion. But can you comment a little bit? I mean, you've touched on it here, but in terms of identifying something so in such a binary way as healthy versus unhealthy seems to ignore a lot of the nuances. Could you shed some light?
Yeah, I think that's well, certainly I agree. And that's, the recent paper we wrote on animal source foods is really to combat this idea that animal source foods are not healthy, they're not sustainable, they're not ethical. Beef, I think, is a key one. On the nutrition side, it's saturated fat, it's risk of cancer, it's even diabetes has been implicated. There's a lot of different potential issues, and processed meat is, there's a bit more evidence behind that. This sort of great food transformation or trying to transform food systems, I think it's necessary to make important changes across the food system to grow our food sustainably, especially considering the increasing global population. But of course, there is a lot of nuance in that. And I don't think it's helpful to have a message that meat is bad or red meat even is bad and all plants are fine, because there's actually a lot of undernutrition, which are sort of deficiencies in nutrients, things like iron and zinc, stunting in children, anemia in women as well. The causes of these are actually from a very low intake of animal source food or not enough intake. And so I think it's important to just realize there are some risks of animal source foods, of course, and there are a lot of benefits. But what I don't really appreciate is when there's sort of a one-sided view that really there's no benefit to consuming meat, there's no benefit to animal source foods. We really should just be transitioning to plant-based foods. I think that's it's not really reflective of the evidence, and it can actually be problematic if you think about society and livelihoods and cultures and how we kind of depend on different sources of food and income.
Yeah, definitely, obviously, a lot to unpack there. And I think some of the ones that you mentioned, even within the Eat Lancet guidelines of, eggs being a lower recommendation than even sugar, which seems really bizarre when we just think of nutrient density and, of course, energy. And your recent paper, Animal Source Foods in Healthy, Sustainable, and Ethical Diets, so many different avenues to discuss. And you touch on three areas that we sort of oversimplify the narrative. The first being human health, which we'll dive into now, and of course the planet, and then the animals themselves. And when we talk about why, the case against animal-based sources is often, as we're saying here, overstated. Nutrient deficiencies is definitely one, which you touched on there. The other one that we see is that association with particularly processed red meat comes with the overconsumption of the energy dense foods that you get with the rest of your Happy Meal, which is the French fries, the soda, and everything else, which confounds things. So can you talk a little bit about, on that health side, that why might that case against meat be overstated?
Yeah, I think you raise an important point. There's a lot of observational studies that look at correlations between things. And so you can look at, how much red meat do you consume, how much processed meat do you consume, and what are your health risks? And in these studies, there's no way to absolutely detect some sort of causal relationship, but there is an attempt, at least in well-designed studies, to say, look, let's try to account for a lot of what are called confounding variables. So variables that may be actually deriving the causal relationship. So let's say it's the Happy Meal or the Big Mac. It could be the fries or the soda. It could be that the people who eat that type of food are less active. It could be that they have lower income. All of these factors, and in modeling, a lot of studies try to account for some of those, and they say, okay, we're going to adjust for that in a model that's like a multivariable model. The problem is a couple things. One, we can't measure, and we don't measure all of the what we would say are known potential confounders. So we don't always have data on everything that could be confounding the relationship. And second, there are a number of confounders that we don't have a clear idea. And so observational evidence can only provide so much insight. And when you look at the evidence, you actually see some conflicting findings. We see some studies showing that there is a pretty clear association between red meat and processed meat, and other studies that show less of an association or no association. But in general, processed meat has much stronger associations, and there's actually more, I think, reasoning for why that can be problematic. Sodium, preservatives like nitrates and nitrites, etc. Unprocessed red meat, there are a few different pathways. Foods high in saturated fat can increase cholesterol. There is some concern with high amounts of heme iron, especially if you don't have a lot of plant-rich foods and fiber and things that are actually kind of protect against any excess in heme iron. But in general, it's a smaller segment of the population that really has an issue with too much, probably. And so, yeah, it's complicated, but ultimately the evidence is mixed with unprocessed red meat. And I think from my perspective, people are all over the map on this. My perspective, there's sort of a U-shaped curve. You have too little red meat that's actually not optimal in a lot of ways. Not that you can't be optimally healthy, but for most people, adding in some unprocessed red meat to a balanced diet really can help improve satiety, improve nutrient adequacy, etc. And there's not a lot of evidence that moderate amounts can really increase your risks substantially of non-communicable diseases. So if I say moderate amounts, what I'm referring to is something probably around the range of 10 to 45 grams of red meat. Something in that, some kind of broad range there, but something where it's not above the WHO recommendations for cancer risk. And so what you tend to see is when you get to higher levels of intake, there is an increased risk. And for me, that's my perspective. I think you have a lot of sort of plant-based or vegans advocates showing evidence of replacement studies where you model the replacement of red meat with a plant protein.
Yep. And
you often see a benefit to cardiovascular disease or different non-communicable disease risk factors. And so there is that piece of evidence. I think that's important to consider. But what I also think is important is that it's not necessarily the replacement of red meat. It could be that it's the inclusion of these plant-rich foods. So what if you replace something else? What if you replace starchy vegetables? What if you replace the ultra-processed foods that you're consuming? I think you'd see a really strong benefit. And so I'm not really convinced that moderate amounts of unprocessed red meat are an increased risk, and they have a lot of benefits. So I would sort of say they're around the neutral range to positive if you think about their overall contribution.